Welcome back to One on One, New York's longest running sports call in show. I am Evan Harkin, joined alongside Jack Warner, and we are more than excited to have the opportunity for a special interview today with author Keith O'Brien. Keith is a Cincinnati native and Northwestern University alumni who has written many well recognized books, including New York Times bestseller Fly Girls, and the book we plan to discuss today, Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose, and the last glory days of baseball. But before we get into the specifics, how are you on this MLB opening day afternoon, Keith?
I'm doing great, guys. Thanks for having me.
Now, your newest book, Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose, and the Last Glory Days of Baseball, was published this past Tuesday, March 26th, featuring endless knowledge on the Pete Rose scandal and baseball as a sport. What was your favorite aspect of writing this book, whether that be interviewing Rose himself, collecting data to shed light on unknown facts about your hometown hero, or any other part of the journey?
I did so many interviews for this book with people who at times had never spoken before. And so many of them were filled with powerful moments. And that's the thing that I think is interesting about Pete Rose. If you passed through his orbit in the 1960s and 70s when Pete was at the peak of his fame, oftentimes you got sucked in by his gravitational pull. And a moment that was defining for Pete Rose by accident became defining for the other people, sometimes in good ways, sometimes in destructive ways. And in my interviews with these folks, it was clear that that even now, decades later, at times 50 years later, they still couldn't shake that moment. On many occasions, people I interviewed became emotional when thinking about the past. And, I think that was just a stunning thing to see as a journalist. But I do understand it because the thing is, in the past 35 years since Pete has been banished, we seem to have forgotten who he really is or who he once was. And the fact is, whether you like him or not, whether you support him or not, he was an American icon, and you simply cannot tell the story of baseball in America in the 20th century without Pete Rose. So, I wanted to go back and tell that story, the rise and the fall, the good and the bad, put that story out there, look at it through the prism of history, let people come to their own conclusions.
One of the things that I love about your choice of subject matter for this book is that I don't think you could have picked a better topic to write about, considering this has been a topic that has had very split opinions amongst baseball fans for decades. I mean, we're talking a player whose career was mostly in the 60s and 70s. And as you mentioned, it's been now around 30 years since, he was banned from Major League Baseball. So one of the questions that really first came to mind when I was taking all of this in was, how much more impactful do you think this story of Pete Rose is when you consider that it's not just a baseball player at the end of the day? This is a first ballot Hall of Famer talent, one of the greatest hitters, to some the greatest hitter that's ever lived, that is being denied enshrinement because of obviously his past involvements and his past actions, rather than a lesser known, ball player that has met this demise. How much more impactful do you think that makes this entire story?
Yeah, what I think makes it most impactful is the narrative when you look at it through the prism of a man. Pete Rose was never the best player on his youth baseball teams. He was never the best player on his high school teams. Pete Rose, frankly, had no business ever escaping a working class life on the west side of Cincinnati. We probably never should have heard his name. But despite all of that, he makes it happen. He gets a shot at the minor leagues. He scrapes and claws his way to the top, and then he loses it all. And in that narrative arc right there is like the American story. You know, we love to tell ourselves that story, that if we work hard, if we dedicate ourselves, if we hustle, like Pete Rose hustled, you know, that we can do anything, we can achieve anything. That is the American story. And I think that is one reason why we are so fascinated with the story of Pete Rose, because in a great many ways, it's the story of ourselves.
Keith, there really couldn't be a better time for the book to be published this past Tuesday. And I say that a lot because of the relevance around sports gambling right now, especially in the MLB and with the ongoing Shohei Ohtani scandal. With the scandal being so popular, there's a recent viral video on social media where Pete Rose himself is featured next to a friend saying, quote, "Well, back in the 70s and 80s, I wish I had an interpreter. I'd be off scot-free." Scot-free being a term which refers to getting away with it. And this statement illustrates that Rose believes Ohtani is somewhat lying in his involvement within the scandal. What was your immediate reaction to this statement by Rose? And do you agree with what he's saying in the video?
My immediate reaction was, this is classic Pete Rose. He couldn't stay out of it. He had to inject himself into it, you know, and you know, in doing so, yeah, he made a viral video that is, you know, on its face, sort of funny. What's funny to me is that, you know, he sort of did have interpreters in the 1970s and 80s. Let's remember, Pete Rose was not betting on baseball himself. He very rarely ever interacted with a bookie on his own. You know, it was men in his inner circle, his close friends, guys who would do anything for him, who were placing his bets for him and paying off his debts or collecting his winnings. And, you know, one of those guys is prominently featured in the book. I did more than a dozen hours of interviews with him. His name is Tommy Giosa. He's still alive today. And in the 1970s and 80s, Tommy Giosa is one of those people who gets sucked in to Pete Rose's gravitational pull and he can't escape. And because he loves it, he loves having Pete Rose's attention, as many young men might have in that time. And you know, but soon, you know, it's Tommy who's you know, hiding his mistresses and girlfriends. It is Tommy who is placing his bets with bookies. It's Tommy who's going around Cincinnati with a duffel bag full of cash to pay the bookies, and it's Tommy who's ultimately placing bets on baseball. And a funny story, guys, just the other night, on the night of my first book event this week, I was in New York City and I was walking to the bookstore. I'm like 5 blocks away on the Upper West Side, and I get a text from Tommy. Tommy Giosa texts me and he says, "Have you seen Pete's video, the viral video y'all mentioned?" And I said, "Yeah, of course I have." And Tommy wrote, "I guess he forgot that I was his interpreter."
I think you saying that the classic Pete Rose is such a perfect way to sort of encapsulate, you know, the actions and sort of the personality of Pete Rose, because even with the irony of this situation being one that relates to obviously gambling and gambling rules in professional sports, I can think of other times in which, because Pete Rose is not always the most likable fellow, as I'm sure you've even mentioned earlier, you've made it very clear he's not always the most likable guy. He's definitely a personality. I can even think back to when Ichiro broke the hits, you know, it was approaching and eventually broke the hits record, and it was Pete Rose who was the first guy to say, you know, were all those hits in the MLB? Did he do it in the big leagues? Did he do all of them? So he's definitely always been a very vocal, for better or for worse, guy. So I think to say typical Pete Rose is a very funny way to put a bow on that personality. But I do want to finish this interview off with one final question. And just this kind of just ties into the whole, you know, topic of, you know, obviously betting and gambling rules and professional sports as a whole. As someone who, like yourself, who has become extremely, you know, knowledgeable in terms of, professional athletes intersecting with sports gambling and, just that subject matter as a whole. What are your predictions for the future of two enormous industries, professional sports and gambling and sports betting, operating alongside each other? Do you think that leagues will eventually change their rules on sports gambling, perhaps some point in the future, whether they become more strict or perhaps maybe even less strict? Will these rules perhaps be formed with some sort of intent to maybe lighten up on the policies because there's been, multiple scandals throughout major sports with regard to sports gambling? Or do you think that these rules will be formed to even further restrict, maybe even further penalize and ensure that you won't run into these scandals with professional athletes anymore?
Well, let's be clear. Sports gambling in particular, and gambling at large, is one of the fastest growing industries in America right now. And that is surely going to continue. Last year we legally wagered about $120 billion on sports legally. Just to put that in perspective, if we had instead just pooled our money instead of wagering it, we could have used that money to buy every single Major League Baseball team, and we still would have had about $40 billion around in our pockets. So it's an enormous amount of money. It's a record amount of money. It shattered the previous year's record in 2022. We're probably going to break it again this year. And it is fundamentally changing sports. You can't watch a game now without the advertising during the commercials or the signs around the field. At times, especially during the big games, announcers will break in to tell us in the moment what the odds are of a certain thing happening, should we want to place bets on that thing on our phone. And, it's not going away. It's been legalized in 38 states. It's incredibly popular. Full disclosure, I sometimes place legal bets on my phone. But it is changing the sport. I think it's also fundamentally changing our culture. And we're seeing it this week in the headlines. It's not just the Shohei Ohtani story and the story about his former interpreter in Southern California. It's the story of an NBA player and curious wagers around his games. Story of a college basketball game and curious wagers around those games. And, you open the sports page this week and the gambling scandal headlines are everywhere. And I do just think that is going to be the new world order going forward. And to answer your question specifically, I think the partnerships between legal gambling platforms and the sports will continue to grow and continue to be lucrative. But I do also think that there will probably be some sort of backlash here in the coming months or years. That will probably lead to further restrictions in some way. What those restrictions will be, how they would be enforced, I don't know. I can't predict the future. But when we legalized gambling in America, it was on a state-by-state basis. We sort of threw open the doors. It's been wild, wild west for a few years now. And I do think while the industry will continue to grow, there will likely be some further restrictions in the years ahead.
Well, as much as we'd love to sit here and pick your brain all afternoon, Keith, there's plenty of baseball that needs to be watched on this 2024 opening day. So that is going to do it from us here with you. A huge shout out and thank you to Keith O'Brien for taking time out of his day to share with us. If you're a baseball fan, sports fan, or just a Keith O'Brien fan, be sure to read his newest book, Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. From Jack Warner alongside me, I'm Evan Harkin saying so long from WFUV Sports.